He broke in. He killed her. He took the ring off her finger. Then he walked out into the night and disappeared for nearly 4 decades. The thing that finally caught him was something that did not exist the night he did it. Her name was Terri McAdams, 22 years old. A student at the University of Texas at Arlington. She had moved to Arlington from Little Rock, Arkansas, where her mother and her sisters Karen and Pamela still lived. By February of 1985 she was engaged, sharing an apartment with her fiancé at the Walnut Ridge Apartments on Walnut Hill Circle, and planning a wedding. She was building the kind of life she had worked toward: classes, a relationship, a future that was starting to take shape. Valentine's Day. February 14, 1985. Her fiancé was out of town on a documented business trip and flying home that evening. Terri was supposed to pick him up from the airport. According to reporting by former Dallas Morning News journalist Karen Anderson, she spent part of that afternoon baking a heart-shaped cake for him. That evening she spoke with a family member by phone. It was the last contact anyone had with Terri McAdams. At some point that night, an intruder forced open the sliding glass door connected to the bedroom. Terri was attacked inside the apartment and did not survive. The Tarrant County medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma. Evidence collected at the scene indicated she had also been the victim of a violent crime beyond the homicide. Her engagement ring was taken from her finger. The following morning, a maintenance worker entered the unit to check on a reported issue and found her. Terri's fiancé flew home that evening expecting to see her at the airport. He came back to a crime scene. Arlington police arrived at the Walnut Ridge Apartments on the morning of February 15, 1985. What they found was a processed crime scene waiting to be read. They worked it carefully. Biological evidence was collected from inside the apartment. Fingerprints were lifted. Outside the bedroom entry point, pressed into the dirt near the forced sliding glass door, investigators documented a distinctive boot print. Every piece of physical evidence was logged, sealed, and placed into storage. The officers who worked that scene that morning had no way of knowing those sealed containers would sit in storage for the next 36 years. The fiancé was eliminated as a suspect within hours. His business trip was documented. His flight records were confirmed. His timeline placed him in another city when Terri was killed. He was not a factor in the investigation from that point forward. Detectives turned their attention to the Walnut Ridge Apartments and the surrounding area. They canvassed the complex door by door. They pulled criminal records on residents and nearby individuals with a history of offenses against women. They conducted interviews across the complex and expanded into the surrounding neighborhood. When the first round of canvassing was complete, they went back and did it again, knocking on doors they had missed the first time and following up on names that had come in through tips. One name came back quickly. A 30-year-old man who lived near the complex. A registered sex offender with a documented history of offenses against women. Prior to February 14, 1985, he had been arrested twice for sex crimes. He lived within minutes of the Walnut Ridge Apartments. And the boot print documented outside Terri's bedroom entry point matched his shoe size. Detectives polled his full background. They checked his alibi. They cross-referenced everything available. It was not enough to move forward. Matching a shoe size placed him in a category shared by dozens of men in Arlington. In 1985, there was no forensic DNA testing available to local investigators, no CODIs, no national DNA database of any kind. The biological evidence sealed in storage after the scene was processed contained the identification. The technology to extract it did not exist. The man was questioned. He was released. The investigation continued through the remainder of 1985. Detectives followed every tip. They expanded the search radius into neighboring jurisdictions. They ran background checks on every name that surfaced. By the end of the year, the McAdams homicide remained an open case with no viable suspects and no clear path to an arrest. In 2024, Arlington homicide detective Devin Coffer would state publicly that the investigators who worked the scene in 1985 were thorough and that the physical evidence they collected would later prove vital to the entire resolution of the case. That assessment was accurate. Everything that eventually identified the killer traces directly back to what those officers preserved on the morning of February 15, 1985. But in the closing weeks of that year, none of that mattered yet. The case file was active. The leads were cold. And the man detectives had questioned and released was still walking free. 8 to 9 months after Terri McAdams was killed, Bernard Sharp made his final move. On November 3, 1985, Sharp forced his way into a home in Arlington. Inside was his estranged wife, Denise Sharp, 29. With her was her best friend, Deborah De La Torre, 25. Denise's cousin was also present. Sharp was armed. He shot Denise Sharp. He shot Deborah De La Torre. He turned the weapon on Denise's cousin and left her critically wounded. Denise's cousin managed to get out of the house and reach a neighbor. According to Fort Worth Star-Telegram archives from 1985, the neighbor later recalled the cousin saying Bernard had gone berserk and shot everybody. Sharp then turned the gun on himself. Denise Sharp and Deborah De La Torre were both killed. The identities of both victims were confirmed by the Tarrant County Medical Examiner. Denise's cousin survived. The incident was ruled a domestic murder-suicide. Bernard Sharp was identified as the perpetrator. Bernard Sharp was dead. At no point did anyone connect November 3 to February 14. The reason was structural. The McAdams homicide was an open stranger homicide filed in one section of the Arlington Police Department. The November incident was a closed domestic murder-suicide handled by a separate set of detectives under a completely different case category. In 1985, there was no cross-referencing system designed to link an unresolved stranger homicide to a closed domestic incident. The name Bernard Sharp had appeared on an interview list in the McAdams investigation months earlier. That fact was sitting in a case file. Nobody had a reason to look for it. The McAdams file was shelved. Over the following years, detectives retired and transferred. New investigators inherited the case periodically, reviewed the file, resubmitted evidence against whatever databases had expanded since the last review, and came back with nothing. The case moved on no one's priority list because the case produced no leads. Terri's sister Karen kept calling. She contacted the detective's office over the years and asked if anything had changed. The answer was always the same. At the joint press conference held in August 2024, Karen Hopper confirmed that after nearly 4 decades her family had given up hope that anyone would ever be identified. They had spent more years waiting for an answer than Terri had been alive. That was where the case stood going into 2021. If cold cases solved through DNA and forensic genealogy are the reason you follow this channel, the Cold Case playlist has full investigations broken down from the first confirmed fact to the final identification. It is linked on screen now. Back to Terri. The evidence collected from Terri's apartment on February 15, 1985 had been sitting in sealed storage for 13 years when the FBI launched CODIS in 1998. CODIS stands for Combined DNA Index System. It is a national database maintained by the FBI that stores DNA profiles collected from convicted offenders across the country. When crime scene DNA is submitted to the system, it is run against every profile in the database automatically. If the person who left the evidence at a crime scene has a qualifying conviction on record and was required to submit a sample, the system generates a match. For cold cases with biological evidence in storage, CODIS represented the first real opportunity since 1985 to put a name to what happened at the Walnut Ridge Apartments. Arlington investigators submitted the McAdams evidence. No match came back. Bernard Sharp had never been required to submit a DNA sample to any law enforcement database at any point during his lifetime. He was not in the system. The submission returned nothing. The evidence went back into storage. Detectives revisited the case again in the years that followed, each time running the available material against an expanding database, each time hitting the same result. The profile of the unknown male suspect existed only as biological material sealed in a container. It had never been converted into a workable genetic profile that could be compared against anything beyond CODIS. That changed in 2021. Arlington investigators sent the preserved biological evidence for advanced forensic DNA analysis. For the first time in 36 years, a complete genetic profile of the unknown male suspect was successfully extracted from the 1985 evidence. It was a significant forensic milestone. The profile was submitted to CODIS. No match returned. The profile now existed in a form that could be read, analyzed, and compared. The identity behind it still did not. Sharp was dead. He was not in CODIS. He was not in any public database. The profile sat confirmed and complete with nowhere to go. That was the state of the McAdams investigation at the end of 2021. A complete suspect profile. No corresponding identity. No path forward through any existing database. What the case needed was not more evidence. What it needed was a completely different approach. In August 2023, the Arlington Police Department contacted the FBI Dallas field office with a specific request. They wanted to know whether the McAdams case qualified for a process called Investigative Genetic Genealogy. IGG is not an extension of CODIS. It operates on a fundamentally different principle. Where CODIS matches crime scene DNA against a database of convicted offenders, IGG uploads the unknown DNA profile to public ancestry platforms. These are the same databases where private individuals submit their own genetic information voluntarily to trace their family histories. The system then searches for biological relatives of the unknown person. Not the person themselves, but anyone in those databases who shares enough DNA to indicate a family connection. A sibling, a cousin, a second cousin who submitted their profile out of personal curiosity 10 years ago and never thought about it again. Once a relative is identified, the investigative work shifts to genealogy. Investigators build a family tree using publicly available records, birth certificates, death records, marriage filings, and address histories. That tree is worked backward and cross-referenced until the unknown individual can be placed within it. Since the technique was first used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, it has been applied to hundreds of cold cases across the United States where CODIS had returned nothing for years. The McAdams case was accepted. In January 2024, the case was formally assigned to Arlington Police Department Homicide Detective Devin Coffer. The 2021 DNA profile was uploaded to public ancestry databases. Genealogical research began. Family connections were mapped. Public records were cross-referenced. The process worked backward through branches of a family tree that had no idea it was being constructed. The process identified a family. The process pointed to a name. Bernard Sharp. The same Bernard Sharp whose name had appeared on an interview list in 1985. The same man Arlington detectives had questioned and released because the science to confirm what they suspected did not yet exist. Dead since November 3, 1985. And that was the problem. Sharp had been dead for 39 years by the time his name came back up. No DNA sample had ever been collected from him by any law enforcement agency at any point during his lifetime. He was not in CODIS. He was not in any public ancestry database. There was no direct sample anywhere in existence to run a comparison against. Genetic genealogy had identified him as the most probable source of the crime scene DNA. But probable was not confirmed. Without a direct comparison against Sharp's own DNA, the identification could not be closed. Investigators needed a living biological reference point. They found one. An out-of-state relative of Bernard Sharp whose DNA shared enough genetic material with the crime scene profile to serve as a direct biological comparison. FBI agents traveled to meet that person face to face. They explained the full scope of the investigation. They explained what a voluntary DNA sample would allow them to do and what it would mean for the case. They made clear the sample was entirely voluntary. No obligation. No legal compulsion of any kind. The relative agreed to provide a sample. That agreement was the difference between a probable identification and a confirmed one. Between 39 years of silence and a name. The entire investigative chain, the 1985 evidence preservation, the 2021 profile build, the months of genealogical research, came down to one person's decision to say yes. The sample was sent to the Center for Human Identification at the University of North Texas Health Science Center in Fort Worth. The center is one of the leading forensic DNA facilities in the country and specializes in genetic analysis for law enforcement identification cases. The lab ran a direct comparison between the relative sample and the biological evidence sealed in storage since February 15, 1985. The results confirmed the match. The DNA belonged to Bernard Sharp. Detective Devin Coffer received the call from the lab. He stated publicly afterward that getting that confirmation meant everything in the world. Arlington PD confirmed the attack on Terri McAdams was random and opportunistic. Sharp had no prior connection to her. He did not know her name. He did not know she had sisters who called to check on her or a mother back in Little Rock who picked up every time she rang. He chose an apartment. He found a way in. And for 39 years no one could place his name alongside hers. On August 14, 2024, the Arlington Police Department and the FBI Dallas Field Office held a joint press conference at Arlington Police Department headquarters. Arlington Police Chief Al Jones stood at the podium and named Bernard Sharp publicly as the man responsible for the death of Terri McAdams. 39 years after the fact. FBI Special Agent in Charge Chad Yarbrough addressed the role of investigative genetic genealogy in the resolution, describing it as one of the most powerful investigative tools available to law enforcement today. Detective Devin Coffer addressed the press and directed his remarks toward the investigators who had worked the original scene in February 1985, crediting their careful evidence preservation as the foundation that made the entire identification possible. Karen Hopper attended the press conference alongside 3 other family members. Then Karen stepped forward. 39 years after her sister was killed on Valentine's Day, Karen Hopper told the room she could not believe they were standing there that day. She said there were no words sufficient to define how it felt. She confirmed that after nearly 4 decades the family had given up hope that anyone would ever be identified. And she said she knew that Terri and their parents were watching that moment. The announcement gave the family a confirmed name. It gave them a verified truth. It could not give them an arrest. It could not give them a trial. There was no sentencing, no courtroom, no opportunity to face the man responsible. Bernard Sharp had been dead since November 3, 1985. There was no one left to charge. Chief Al Jones closed the press conference with a statement that it would have been easy over the years to accept that the case would never move. He said the family never gave up and the detectives never wavered. On February 14, 1985, Terri McAdams baked a heart-shaped cake for the man she was going to marry. He was coming home that day. She never got to give it to him. If this case is the kind of content you came here for, subscribe and go straight to the Cold Case playlist. Every case on this channel is broken down from the first confirmed fact to the final identification. Terri's family waited 39 years to hear his name connected to hers. The least we can do is make sure hers is never forgotten.